I mean, there was that, that crap story we wrote the other day. There was about...
We never write crap stories.
Well, it was
just someone else.
It was LG's, finally bringing out the connected fridge.
The talking fridge.
Yeah, the talking fridge.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. This week we have Jamie Davis and Ian from Light Reading. Well, I suppose if I'm going to say Jamie Davis, I should say Ian Morris. There we are. Important to get. And I'm Scott Pacino. Just to remind you that if you're listening to this podcast on SoundCloud or iTunes, you can also watch a video recording on the site, and vice versa. If you're watching a video recording, you can download the audio. This week we're going to be talking about Vivendi calling the shots at Telecom Italia and whether or not that should even be allowed. We're going to be talking about virtual assistants and the battle for the smartphone and asking who, if anyone's going to win. Smartphone, I said it again, didn't I?
Yeah, I've been saying that all morning.
Sorry, listeners, I keep saying smartphone, I mean to say smart home. Home. Right, and then lastly, we're going to talk about operator innovation, and we're going to ask whether they're even capable of change. So, starting off, we're going to throw the ball to you first, Ian. We were both writing about Telecom Italia this morning, who have a new CEO. Why don't you? And we're asking whether the process by which that CEO was appointed was very kosher. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what's happened there?
Yeah, so they've named a new CEO, as you say, who is Amos Genish.
Right.
And it's a little bit controversial because it's sort of another sign of the growing influence over Telecom Italia, I guess, of its main shareholder, which is Vivendi, the French media company.
Right. And how much do they own?
So their stake they're the biggest single shareholder, right, but they only have a stake of 24%.
Right.
Most of the rest of Telecom Italia is owned by sort of foreign and domestic institutional investors. So a bit of a mishmash, yeah. Vivendi's. It's sort of, I think the Italian government actually came out a few weeks ago and said that it regards Vivendi as the kind of de facto controller now of Telecom Italia, and
it's got about half the board, hasn't it?
It's got So the chairman, I think, is a guy called Arnaud de Puyfontaine, which is probably dreadful French pronunciation.
Pierre approved.
He's also the CEO of Vivendi, right?
Right. He's the interim of Tim as well right now, isn't he?
Well,
he's the chairman, I believe, of Tim.
Didn't they? Oh, aside from this site,
you're both right.
Genish was interim. So Genish, who's been named CEO today, was basically brought in the summer.
No, Jamie's also right. Your man Arnaud was interim CEO when they got rid of. I'm sure you're about to get onto this. Is it Cataneo?
Yeah. So the former guy Cataneo was kind of not kicked out, but under pressure to leave in the summer. It's all still a bit unclear exactly what happened there, but. He seemed to fall out with...
and he'd only been there about a year, hadn't it?
He'd been there for a year, and it had been quite a successful year as well, looking at the kind of earnings and sort of taking the company in a pretty good direction, good progress on cost-cutting and everything. Yeah. But then had a few rows with the Italian government, it seemed, about these broadband plans.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
They want to do some sort of state-backed scheme to get broadband in rural areas. Mm-hmm. I think Telecom Italia was kind of bidding in that initially, and then decided not to, but then came back and said they were going to build their own networks anyway,
right.
which upset the government. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like he'd fallen out with Vivendi, and I think the sense was that Vivendi was a bit worried that relations had been damaged with the Italian government, and it was his fault, and he was a bit of a liability. So then he quit, and this guy comes in as general manager, which is Genish, who's now been named CEO today. And I think the sense is that he was always going to be CEO. It's just they didn't want to announce him as CEO at the time because the company's, as I say, the chairman's a Vivendi guy. Yeah. Genish is from Vivendi. They just seemed
he's not Italian.
He's not, and the direction that Telecom Italia is moving in just seems to be doing things more and more to kind of suit Vivendi, I guess.
And I remember covering Cataneo when he got the job a year or so ago. The previous guy was called Patuano, I think.
Yeah. So he fell out with Vivendi as well.
Yeah, and that was about the time when Vivendi made its move for these shares. I think at one stage they peaked at just short of 25%, which is a threshold which if you go over it, then you have to launch a formal takeover bid, isn't it? Yeah. And so they bought all these shares and just went, no, this guy, we're not happy with him. So they got rid of him.
Yeah.
apparently sort of unilaterally. I mean, they clearly have the backing of these institutional investors, but nonetheless, it seemed to be them calling the shots. Got in what seemed to be their guy, and then even he doesn't seem to be obedient enough in the intervening year. So they got rid of him and then got in another guy who they used to
He
manage.
wasn't former Vivendi though, was he? Cataneo.
No,
Cataneo
he
wasn't.
He wasn't former telco either.
No, he was from a utility company, I think.
wa-
He was
he was
energy
a-
sector.
He was an independent advisor to the board, I think. And then, but apparently he was an absolute brilliant sort of like CEO when you look at the utilities side of things.
Well, he was pretty good at Telecom Italia as well.
Yeah. But I think he got named something like Manager of the Year in like 2004 or 2005 or something like that. So he's a really good CEO, but he hasn't got any experience in running.
I mean, I think
Specifically a telco.
I think some of the success that he's had maybe, stems from what Patuano was doing. I mean, I don't really know the source of
how much is stuff that was put in place before he started.
Yeah, a lot of the dispute with Patuano, I think, was to do with Brazil and how important that should be and whether they should get rid of it or something, and the sort of differing priorities there. But with Cataneo coming in after Patuano and having quite a bit of success, I don't know how much of that is directly down to him and how much is.
And talking about Brazil, the Guedes, the new guy, he was the CEO of a company called GVT in Brazil, which at some stage was owned by Vivendi. Right. So their little tentacles. They sold it to Telefonica. So he's been there. He's sort of part of the firm a bit. I mean, the biggest thing to me is this is obviously all legal. And Vivendi is this massive conglomerate, and they know what they're doing, and I'm sure they've got incredibly bright, well-connected guys at the top. But it just strikes me as really odd that a company that owns 24% of another company, that's not even within the same country, although technically probably shouldn't matter, can just be totally calling the shots all the time. And my biggest thing is not whether or not I sort of like it, although it does leave a bad taste in my mouth, but it just feels like acquisition on the cheap. You should have to shell out for 51% of shares, and they're going, do you know what, we're not going to bother. We're going to buy 24% of the shares, and then we're going to have the same influence and power as if we paid more than twice as much.
Well, I suppose, I mean, there are, I suppose, shareholders in other companies that have been quite aggressive, even though they haven't been
activist
in
investors and that sort of thing.
That's happened in Russia a bit, I think.
People like Carl Icahn used to do that sort of thing.
And so it's not unique, I guess, and you do get, on the other hand, you get companies that would just sit there and allow the CEO to do what he wants to do and not sort of be leaned on heavily. But I guess the other institutional investors have just gone along with what Vivendi is doing and haven't had any issues with it.
What about the Italian state? Have they anything to say on the subject?
I mean, you sense there's some kind of resistance to it, because otherwise, why are they coming out with these statements about, Vivendi's now the de facto controller, and they're
about to fine them, aren't they?
There's talk of a fine as well.
300 million.
I don't really know how they can fine them, but I'm not sure what the justification for the fine is. But
and then that fine, they probably find some way of putting that onto a Telecom Italia anyway. And in terms of, I mean, Jamie, I think you did the maths, didn't you? 300 million versus what it would cost to actually buy the chunk of Telecom Italia it would need to buy.
So if they're going to acquire the rest of, that's one of the ways they could have gone down. They could have been forced to, if you were going to have de facto control of Telecom Italia, you've got to buy the rest of it. But I don't know how they can do that, considering the European Commission has already given the thumbs up to say, we're all right with this. You're doing okay there.
Well, I suppose they're not in de facto control. They're just considered to be in de facto control.
Well, I mean, I think they are. I mean, everything that seems to happen regarding CEOs and that sort of thing, it seems to be completely determined by Vivendi.
because the other institutional investors have gone along with it.
Yeah.
And because it's so fragmented, there's nobody with like 45% or anything who's saying,
So I suppose there's a bit of a structural flaw in sort of shareholder capitalism, full stop there. Yeah. But I
mean, I guess that why the Italian state might worry is just that usual. There's a protectionist instinct in a lot of southern European countries. Telcos are viewed as big, important assets for sort of strategic and security reasons. Yeah. And I think the other issue with Vivendi is that they own broadcast assets in Italy as well through Mediaset. Yeah. So it's is it too dominant across these two sectors? And actually its plans do seem to be. I mean, even in the announcement today about Guedes, there's talk of a deal between Canal Plus, which is the Vivendi pay TV arm, and Telecom Italia doing more stuff on production and convergence, and bundling of services.
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, Vivendi's pretty sort of aggressive generally. They're sniffing around Ubisoft at the moment, and they've generally, throughout history, been quite into the sort of M&A, mucking about with M&A, and they're obviously quite experienced at it. I mean, the threat of the Italian fine just feels like a bit of a shakedown for me. Like they're just going to go, look, carry on, just chuck us 300 mil, and we'll shut up.
I think they'll be all right with it as well. I don't think they'll be bothered. Yeah, like you said, you did a.
Is that what the amount is? 300 million.
Well,
that was a rumour.
What it's rumoured to be, 300 million euros. But
And what are they saying they're fining them for?
For not notifying, some sort of really technical thing, for not just going, oh, by the way, we're going to be calling the shots from now.
Yeah, they had to
quite
give them
pseudo-legal
notification that said, like, we're basically in control now, and they didn't. So, because it's like you said, it's an asset which they rely heavily on for security and sort of like just general communication. So, losing control of it from losing it from Italian hands is seen as a big no-no. But 300 million. I did it on admittedly back of the pack of fags, but $19.1 billion, I think Tim's worth at the moment, and to acquire the remaining 76% would be just below 15 billion. So, controlling a company,
even if you're only getting to 51%, you're still looking at
still looking at 7.5
lots of billions, not 300 million,
6 billion or something like that. But you'd take a 300 million euro fine over acquiring the 50, the controlling stake of.
That was on the understanding that then the Italians are just going to shut up and let Vivendi do what it wants. One other thing, talking about that, I don't know if you've read this. Good old Silvio Berlusconi, who was the Prime Minister for ages and is a I think majority or very significant minority shareholder of Mediaset, which Vivendi's been sniffing around. Well, apparently he's running for government again. I don't know how old the bloke is.
Pretty old now, yeah.
Yeah, he's getting on a bit, but he still fancies it. And if he got in, presumably the sort of political climate towards Vivendi would change a little bit. So that could be interesting. And maybe they're feeling in a bit of a hurry. Maybe this is one of the reasons why Cataneo, even though he'd done a decent job, they sort of turfed him out just to make sure they get one of their real sort of part of the gang guys in.
Maybe that's the reason why a takeover would be sensible in the long run, because you might have some agreement about a fine, but who knows what's going to happen in the future under a different administration.
They might think they're being really clever just by writing a cheque to the Italian state right now, but as you say, the goalposts could shift. And obviously, if the institutional investors, if people who own Tim are all right with it, then it's not really for me to object. But there's just something about the whole thing that just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. It just seems a bit dodgy and a bit sly and a bit under the radar.
Well, I guess it's this issue to some extent of companies that were formerly state owned and as I say, kind of considered important from a security and strategic perspective, and also with the rollout of broadband networks, very important economically. And how much the state is involved in that still, following the privatisation of these companies, and you see that in other parts of Europe as well to some extent. I think even in in Germany, where the state does still have quite a big share of Deutsche Telekom.
Right.
One of the parties that was running in the election that's just happened, which could, I think, play quite a big role in this sort of coalition government, the FDP.
They were talking about slightly more loony ones.
No, they're the.
You're not talking about AFD.
No. Right, the FDP. Maybe the fourth or fifth biggest party, I think, and they're a pro-business party. But they talked about selling the state shares in Deutsche Telekom and Deutsche Post, which is a postal business, and using the kind of proceeds to fund the rollout of like a state-owned broadband network, because they don't see Deutsche Telekom doing enough in that area. And
even Vodafone with its $2 billion.
Right. Yeah, and even BT as well. There's always this sort of toing and froing. There's always this pressure about regulation and Ofcom. Should it be structurally separated? Is it fair that regulations are done in the way they're done, given that it used to be a state-owned asset and all of its networks were originally built that way?
No, and this is why our industry is so heavily regulated, because the barrier to entry is so high. Mm-hmm. Rolling out. Most places haven't even done it properly. Rolling out a proper modern network is prohibitively expensive. And hardly anyone can do it. And as you say, the former state monopoly obviously has a massive advantage because they will have had a lot of that work done for them. And Telecom Italia is presumably a former state monopoly.
Yeah,
judging by the
I think
name.
all the incumbents started out that way, didn't they? And then were subsequently privatised to varying degrees. Some of them completely, and some still. I think
And there's
still
not much
quite a lot of Deutsche Telekom in state hands.
But not much
actually.
state ownership of Telecom Italia.
I mean, I imagine there's some, but I don't think it seems to be a lot. I mean, obviously Vivendi's got this 24%, 58% is in the hands of foreign institutional investors.
80 odd already.
Yeah, some domestic institutional investors make up most of the rest, I think.
So that's that. I kind of joked when I wrote it up that they'll probably, their board meetings will now be conducted in French and all that sort of thing, just to complete the appropriation of the company by Vivendi. We'll see how it goes. We'll see if they get fined. We'll see if Berlusconi gets in one day and throws his toys out the pram or whatever. But yeah, I couldn't help just thinking there was something comically inevitable about a Vivendi guy being chucked in there. So there we go. Okay, so moving on. Jamie, this week you've been writing quite a lot about the smart home. And specifically today it's culminated in a piece where you asked where the battle for the soul of the smartphone is going to occur, who the big players are. So
Smart home.
Did I do it again?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. Can we just call it something else? We can call it Dave. From now on, the smart home is going to be called Dave. So the battle for Dave, who the big players are, who's going to win. So before I just say it wrong again, why don't you take it from here?
Well, this week has just been sort of Google and Amazon just trading blows with each other, mainly on the hardware side, but there was a little skirmish with Google saying to Amazon or pulling access to YouTube on the Echo Show,
right?
Which is their device that has a screen on it. It looks a bit like an alarm clock, but it's basically a smart speaker with a screen. And obviously this, not having YouTube, the most popular video platform on the planet, on your visual speaker, it's a bit of a dig. But I mean, it's one of these things that I just don't think it's going to matter to these two in the long run.
Right.
Like hardware, I just don't. It works for them now because it's a showpiece. And it gets the rest of the industry moving.
You're talking about their own branded smart,
the Echo,
hardware,
the Google Home speaker. I just don't see them having particularly long-term ambitions in playing in the hardware space.
Right.
First of all, I think it's just a way to get everyone else moving. They've said, right, we'll do this as a loss leader, just so we can demonstrate to the rest of the electronics industry that there is an appetite for connected devices, and now you're starting to see, pretty much every electronics manufacturer out there putting some sort of platform or sort of connectability into their devices. And secondly, I just can't see, as soon as you get into mass market, who's going to buy? If my mum and dad's, they're not going to buy a Google speaker. They're going to buy something that they recognise, or they're not going to buy an Amazon TV because Samsung and Sony have been dominating that space for 30 years. So as soon as you get into mass market, these people are going to go to brands they trust. But it doesn't matter because the software is where they're going to make all the money.
So in future, you think that people will go out and get these speakers, but there'll be other companies that are building the hardware and branding that, and the Google platform sits on it, and the Alexa platform, basically.
So I think that's where the battle's going to be won. How many? If we've all got a smart speaker in our living room, you might have one from Bose, you might have one from Samsung, I might have one from LG or something like that. It's completely irrelevant, but the partnerships underpinning those, has Bose got a partnership with Amazon or Google, or LG has it got it with Amazon or Google? That's where the money's going to be made. Having that virtual assistant in as many different places as possible will control the flow of money coming out of the living room and the relationships between you as a consumer and Domino's, for instance, facilitating those relationships like Google does. Sorry, not like Google, like Facebook does on social media.
Yeah.
That is where I see the real cash coming from, and that'll be the winner of the smart home, or Dave.
Yes. I was hoping you would say smartphone there.
And are there signs that those hardware players are trying to sort of get in with?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, pretty much. I mean, there was that. That crap story we wrote the other day. There was about.
We never write crap stories.
Well, it was just someone else. It was LG's finally bringing out the connected fridge,
the talking fridge.
Yeah, the talking fridge or the oven. They got like 87 products in that now can be a virtual assistant can be connected to them, and it's just going to be that's what's going to happen. And in the kitchen, Google isn't going to all of a sudden start making ovens just purely because it wants the virtual assistant in there, but because it's demonstrated to the rest of the ecosystem that there is an appetite for connected devices, everyone else is starting to catch on.
I agree. I think you're right. The hero product thing. Obviously Google and Amazon are the ones investing most overtly in these hero products. And that applies. This is one time where I can say smartphone and it won't be wrong. The thing we spoke about a week or two ago on the pod about Google buying the choicest bits of HTC show that it's still interested in hardware to sort of make a point. But I think you're right. They're not necessarily mass market devices. They're hero devices. They're exemplars. They're going, look, this is what you can do.
It actually works. I think the best way to think of it is like computer games. Think of it as a side quest. The ultimate objective is to get the virtual assistant in every home and in every device possible. But before you can actually get the virtual assistant there, you've got to get the connected devices in there. So they're stimulating growth in the connected in the electronics arena by showing the likes of LG saying, look, people do actually want it and people will pay money for it.
And Amazon's got good form on this. I mean, way back when it first came out with the Kindle, there wasn't a proven market for e-readers, and it was probably selling them at cost or maybe even at a loss. But they, in hindsight, successfully catalysed this electronic book, digital book market, which is pretty big now, I presume.
Who dominates that now?
I think it's Amazon.
Right.
Yeah, I think.
But
because I got an Amazon Kindle account. But I don't have a Kindle.
No, I read them on my phone.
Yeah, so
I guess the advantage of having it on your own hardware, because we've got a Kindle Fire, I think it's called.
Right, which is the actual tablet rather than just the e-reader.
Which is a tablet, and you use that, and it's too easy almost to get into the video stuff, and some of the other services that Amazon
So you're
provides.
saying perhaps you'd be better off with just a straight up Kindle?
Well, no, I'm just saying from Amazon's perspective that the hardware side of it there's an interest because it's much easier to get your own software out in somebody's face,
and services, which is the point that Jamie's making.
Yeah, whereas you get an Apple device and you've got to go to the faff of downloading Amazon's app and setting everything up yourself.
But this is where I think. This is where these partnerships will play such a crucial role, because if you look at why is Google one of the most powerful companies on the planet, it's because it's got the Android operating system. Now the Android operating system doesn't say that you have to use Google products, it just has them as default. Now if they work, I don't give a crap about downloading anything else, I'll use the default. So, for instance, if you've got
Google products like Maps and Gmail are very good,
which are the best around anyway. But if you've got a fridge and it comes with the default setting of either Alexa or Google, as long as they work, I mean, I'm not going to change it.
It's the same with the iPhone. I like Google Maps, but I don't actually use it because the Apple Maps thing on the iPhone's good enough.
It is now, is it? Because it wasn't originally. It was a bit rubbish when they launched it.
But the other thing also is that one of the reasons Apple's considered so good, isn't it, is because it controls both the hardware and the software, and that integration works very well. And some of the other apps that you download on devices that where the company isn't responsible for both things can be less stable. You get bug fixes
it's
every other week.
Sort of making this comparison between the phone world and the smart home world that we're now talking about.
Or Dave.
Or Dave to its mates. Because, as Jamie rightly says, Google achieved a real coup with Android by being there at the start, around the same time as the first iPhones were out, which completely revolutionised how we view sort of touchscreens and all that sort of thing, and mobile technology. But what Google did is it offered it for free, in inverted commas, although with lots of strings attached, like Jamie said. But it's still free, and if you were Motorola or HTC or whoever at the time, then you were like, oh, thank God, we're going to go for this, because it looks equivalent, you know, the sort of little icons and all that sort of thing, and we haven't got anything better. A few people tried it, you know, Nokia was persisting with Symbian for a bit, but that clearly wasn't as good. And BlackBerry, bless them, sort of plugged away for a bit, and then as a consequence faded into obscurity. But yes, so that enabled Google to get a stable something in the region of about 80% of global operating system share. You know, Microsoft classically tried to perpetuate its OS licensing model. You know, most of Microsoft's money throughout history has been either from the licensing of Windows or selling boxed Office software. And it went, yeah, well, we're going to make a mobile OS. It was originally called sort of Windows Mobile, and it became called Windows Phone, and all that sort of thing. And we're going to put that out there, and it's going to be really good. And people are going to pay us. OEMs are going to pay us licenses for that. And they went, well, why do we do that when we can get Android for free? Are you stupid? So that didn't last very long.
Have these companies that, as you say, have sort of embraced Android and seen the attractions of it? Is there also another side of the story that, I mean, it's a company like Samsung, for example, which is very much a hardware company and makes a lot of money out of chips and flat panel displays and phones, but it's obviously trying to get more into the software business, and I think there's the recognition generally is that all the value's going into software these days. Hardware is just a commodity.
Totally.
In years to come, you don't want to be a hardware maker, really.
No,
it's a rubbish thing to do.
Unless you're Apple, where you've got a
unless you're Apple, where it controls the software as well, though.
Yeah, but Apple just has a premium. You pay about $100 more for an equivalent device.
But that probably comes, a lot of it, from the fact that they do their own software as well.
Yeah, there's some perceived value. I'm not going to get into whether or not. I personally buy Android phones, but I buy Apple tablets. Yeah. And I'm happy to pay the premium for the tablet, especially for my kids. I just feel it's a more trustworthy environment and all that sort of thing. So anyone make that choice. If they want to pay the premium, fair play to them. But yes, they're the only ones making any profit. When I used to do studies on this stuff when I was an analyst, about 97% or something like that of all profit in smartphones was going to Apple. It was ridiculous.
Right. Is it a problem for Samsung though in the long run?
Yes.
that it hasn't got an operating
definitely,
system?
And they've been trying to. I was sort of leading up to that because I don't think it's directly analogous, that situation in phones, as it is in the smart home, because I don't think we were talking about this before. Firstly, people like Samsung and LG have got their own platforms for smart TVs, and
but that's different though. Having a platform.
Yeah, I'm leading up to it. I'm just saying that there's not a direct analogy between what happened in phones and what's going to happen.
No. But it's just an example, isn't it? That you have a piece of hardware and the money comes from the software that's on it.
Indeed, and the software and services definitely will be where the margin is. But yeah, I just wanted to make the point that it'd probably be a stack further up. So rather than it being the underlying OS, which has enabled Google to then drive eyeballs to Gmail and Maps and search and all that sort of thing, the underlying OS will probably be a bit more fragmented. Because like Samsung's got things derived from Tizen, LG's got stuff derived from WebOS, which was a Palm thing. But then the layer above it, which I think you covered in your story you wrote today, which is like the virtual assistants and the interaction with it.
But that's where the money is. I don't see any money in the operating system.
No, I agree. And that was exactly the point I was making.
But Android doesn't make any money on.
Well, no, indirectly
but it makes money from having that operating system allows it to get its own services out there more easily.
Which is part of the part. I mean, I don't see operating systems being a particularly sort of like attractive area because I don't think regulators are ever going to allow the operating system market to go down the same way as Android before. Because look at all the problems that's caused with sort of competition concerns with watchdogs around the world,
and then just sue them for tons of money.
But at the same time, you can't change the Android system because there's nothing as good as Android out there,
or as free.
But I mean, like we were talking about before, it's the relationship between the consumer and it's the relationship between the consumer and the third party, and that is where I see the money in the smart home is going to come from. I'm not going to pay, Google $10 a year so the virtual assistant can turn my lights on and off. Someone is eventually going to figure out, because that's really simple. Someone's going to eventually figure out how to do that for free. The money is, I'm going to say into my phone, or I'm going to say into my speaker, Google, order me a pizza, and it's going to order it from somewhere local, and it's going to take a slice of the pie somewhere.
Totally.
And I see that interface, that sort of that being the facilitator between the consumer and the
so that
actual
virtual
third
assistant,
party.
that voice UI thing. So then the question this leads to for me, which I sort of touched upon in the introduction, is we're just talking about Google and Amazon right now. Are we going to end up, just as we have with phones, are we going to end up with one or two completely dominant players, do you think, in that space?
No, I don't think so, because firstly, I think in the Western world we probably will for the next sort of couple of years. One thing that has surprised me is that Facebook haven't come in. This idea of sort of like dominating or cultivating an audience and then controlling how you access this and monetizing that access is the Facebook business model. So I'm surprised that they must be having some issues on a software engineering level, because I'm really surprised that it seems like a perfect business for them. But I see Google and Amazon running away with it over here for the next couple of years. But neither of them are going to get a foothold in China if you look at sort of like the way technology is developed traditionally.
And you got companies like Weibo and whatever.
I mean they're going to be given preference in the Chinese market, and then all of a sudden you've got an audience of 1.3 billion people which they can cultivate, monetize, make an amazing product before launching that on the rest of the world.
So the biggest competition from Google and Amazon could come from sort of Tencent type companies.
I think so.
I've got no problem with that.
Yeah,
that makes sense to you?
Yeah, definitely.
And especially if
where it's going to come from.
And especially if you're talking about, who wants to be a hardware player. No one wants to be a hardware player anymore. That's going to go to markets like China, where you have these huge manufacturing companies that are like Foxconn, who are taking they're manufacturing on behalf of other people. So you can imagine manufacturing industries moving more that way, and then all of a sudden, if you've got something manufactured in China, the default is going to be the Chinese virtual assistants.
Are there signs of the Chinese trying to do, some of these companies that you mentioned, like Weibo and Tencent, trying to do things outside China now?
Tencent, definitely. So they bought Supercell, is it? The app developer. So I think Tencent bought Supercell, and that was supposed to be their launch pad into the rest of the world. I think WeChat has, which is, again, it's another Tencent business.
That's ubiquitous in China, isn't it?
WeChat, yeah. So that's basically their version of
they have an English
WhatsApp.
language version as well.
Right.
So that's
WhatsApp / Twitter as well. I mean, there's a sort of, it seems to have some combined functionalities that aren't directly equivalent to any one thing here.
Yeah, I think it's an all-encompassing, and I think it's got some sort of like e-payments
lots of that,
on it as well.
Definitely.
But every Chinese person or every Chinese business that operates in Europe, their employees have sort of WeChat on their phone as well, because obviously you can't, WhatsApp doesn't really work when you go into China.
No, especially right now.
Yeah, so if you're going to communicate with Chinese people in China, you have to have a platform that they can use. But in terms of developing their own AI virtual assistants, I don't know. I haven't looked yet.
Well, definitely have ambitions. I mean, we've had, on the phone side, we have Xiaomi have some international ambitions which haven't necessarily come off yet. But yes, I think we all agree. There's just one thing I wanted to conclude on that one before we move on. Just us personally, the smart home stuff, these virtual assistants, this sort of home automation, all that jazz. I've got to admit, right now it's still bringing out the Luddite in me, and I've got a sort of a feeling of I know I really shouldn't be doing this job at all. I've got a feeling of them being a bunch of solutions searching for a problem. So I'll start with you, Ian. You know, are you seduced by this? Would you like to have more of this sort of gear in your house, or do you already?
I don't, and I've not got a burning desire to have it, but it has I mean, I think the cost of it's quite low, isn't it? The Echo speaker isn't actually very
50
expensive.
quid or something.
Yeah, and it did sort of strike me. Maybe I get one just out of curiosity.
They'll
because
come down
it's not really very
eventually
much
as well.
money, and
Right.
and perhaps
And then
it
they've
proves
got you.
useful. Yeah, well, then of course you're on a slippery road, aren't you? Because you're going to end up sort of using it all the time, probably. But it's like a lot of technologies, isn't it? Before you use them,
Indeed.
you're not missing anything.
But you're not aware of a sort of domestic technology need that is currently that you're desperate to be sort of solved.
No, I mean, but again, once you start using it, I suspect you'd end
Before
up
you know it, it's
before
just
you know
part
it,
of your
you'd be like
MO.
people walking down the street with their smartphones held out in front of them, and you can't get off the damn thing. And, which is maybe one reason why I won't get one. But I probably don't need
So
that.
you're good. You've got Luddite tendencies too. You can join my club. What about you, Jamie? You fancy all this gear?
I'll try it. I haven't done it yet.
Right.
But I don't personally believe you need consumer demand to create a technology revolution. I think there's that. I don't know whether it's actually true, but there's that sort of famous saying from what's his name, Ford, who started Ford, the motor company.
Yes.
He said, if I listen,
Dave Ford, let's call
yeah, Dave Ford. if I listened to my customers, I would have bred faster horses.
Right.
It's sometimes you need to put the idea in front of people and say, look, it's actually really good, and then it catches on.
Apple did that brilliantly with the iPhone. No, you can't argue that. Okay, so it'll just sort of the consensus seems to be that we think it'll insidiously sort of creep its way into our lives, and one of the
I don't know what
reasons
the
is
penetration's like at the moment of these devices in the
pretty low. So I think there was a survey the other day. I think 30% of the UK or the respondents, 30% of Brits have a connected TV,
right.
And that can be just something as simple as you can get
like I've
Netflix.
got for
You can get
watching-
Netflix on your TV or something
Does
like
connected TV mean that means your TV's actually got the link, though? It wouldn't count connecting gaming consoles to it.
that.
to
No,
get that
it's actually
functionality.
on the TV. And then something like 16% of people have like a smart energy meter. So those are the two products that they're the ones you think of when you think of the connected economy, really, aside from smart speakers.
Yeah, and with tellies, it ends up being something that just becomes part of it, like HD. Initially people are like, oh, shall I get an HD? And now I don't think you've got any choice.
To be honest,
it's going to be HD, isn't it?
It'll just get to a point where you'll just buy it because
'cause
it's
built
bog
in.
standard.
Exactly.
It's built in. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's interesting. So this week I went to an event called, I'm trying to remember the precise name, it's something Service Delivery Innovation Summit, something like that, which is basically a summit-led event as opposed to a sort of lots of stands and people sort of telling you about their products, where the underlying theme was innovation, operators, and can they innovate, really, was the question. And that was certainly the question I posed when I wrote it up. So just to give a little bit of background about what was spoken about, things like sort of virtualization, the innovation of the underlying technology that operators have to use came up. But within the context of, the reason you want to switch to NFV, SDN, distributed cloud, all that jazz, is because then it gives you this agility. It's one of these terms. Or if you want to get really buzzwordy, you start talking about things like DevOps and that sort of thing. And what the industry done is it sort of venerates, it puts on a pedestal this Silicon Valley level of agility, failing fast, trying shit out, and then just binning it and moving on to the next one. And then, but then also the ability to scale once it does turn out to be a good idea, really ramping it quickly. And it's all about speed and agility and being on your toes and all that sort of thing. And telcos traditionally tend to operate more like sort of utilities. They're kind of sluggish. They got this sort of super tanker inertia. And they rest on the colossal investment in infrastructure and just basically sweat that asset indefinitely. But they might try and think of the odd bright idea. I was writing it up, I was remembering, I don't know if you remember this, Ian, a thing called Vodafone 360.
This is the original sort of walled garden.
And then trying to have this sort of Vodafone consumer brand where you can sort of consume
that
content.
is going back a while.
It is going back a while, and I just remember it being a reasonably spectacular failure.
Yeah.
Now, fair enough, I'm not going to deride Vodafone for giving it a go, But it was just a great example of an operator trying something that was really outside of their core competence.
Yeah. They've had a success
not
in
doing it very well.
they, really. I mean, the whole GSMA sort of initiative around rich communications
Right.
and whatever they called it, I can't remember the exact buzzy word they gave it, but their attempt to do something with RCS, you know, and have a web-like messaging type, service that various operators could make use of, and it really didn't go anywhere at all. And
all of these are quite defensive moves, aren't they? Because there's a cliche. I've only been doing this gig for 3 or so years. But I was aware of the cliche from day one of the operators stealing our lunch thing. Not operators, sorry, OTTs stealing our lunch thing. And then obviously the dumb pipe cliche, which has probably been around forever, which for those people who don't know what it is just basically telcos operating entirely as a utility, just like a water company or electricity company, rather than having any added value on top of it. And that's what they're all worried about, and quite rightly so, because the more like a utility you are, the more what you do becomes commoditized, and it's just a race to the bottom price-wise, no margins, no ARPU, and it's all a complete nightmare. So that's what they were talking about. And so we had the virtualization and how that's going to help, and then we had some other speakers, some operators coming up with bright ideas. But I suppose what I took from it was that these are all worthy conversations. It's certainly a persistent conversation that happens within the industry. But culturally, are operators capable of making that switch? So, all this talk of DevOps and agility and thinking like a Silicon Valley startup, it's all very well, but if you've got a massive public company of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and the CEO just one day goes, right, all this, the way we've been doing this for decades, that's all going to change. We're all going to start acting like Mark Zuckerberg from now on or whatever. It's really, really difficult to get a group of people to just suddenly change direction and that. So I suppose I asked the question, can they change? I hope they can, but I'm not convinced that they can. What do you reckon, Ian?
I think they have the problem that lots of big companies have generally, which is, as you said, they've been around for a long time. They get sort of stuck in their ways, and then it becomes difficult to change that. I don't know if it's specific to telecom. It's just a sort of, who knows, maybe the likes of Google and Facebook in 10 or 15 years' time will be perceived as big, sluggish companies that don't adapt very quickly, and there's all these working processes that newer startups are starting to make use of, and they're perceived to be, kind of stuck in their ways. And
could already be there.
It's it's true that there was a time when the telco network, you couldn't call them dumb pipes, I guess, because the only service that went over it was voice, and they were the only companies that provided a service on those lines. And now they literally, are companies that just operate the infrastructure, and anything you use over the top of it tends to come from WhatsApp or
Facebook or whatever,
or Facebook or whatever internet company it might be. But I don't know. I'm not convinced that it depends what you mean by innovation, I suppose, because you can have innovation in lots of areas.
No, that's a good question. So they were talking about there was a panel discussion about new customers. Yeah. And I thought that was an interesting thing because, of course, in markets like UK, US, whatever, the subscriber level is pretty much saturated. Everyone's a subscriber, aren't they? Most of them have like 120% subscribers because of multiple. So new customers, you're not going to get brand new customers. You're not going to get people onto the network who previously weren't. All you're really doing is stealing customers off each other. Yeah. So then that just comes back to sort of defensive moves. And someone made the point that, and we'll probably get onto this in a minute. A lot of the investment is in things like content. Yeah. For example, BT buying a bunch of sport, but that's primarily a defensive move for BT to sort of protect and bolster its subscriber level rather than create completely novel revenue streams. So I guess we're not going to have new customers per se, but we might have completely new revenue streams. Yeah. So I guess that's where I think innovation has the potential to pay off.
Well, I think the other thing as well is that there's not necessarily anything wrong with being the dumb pipe and having that kind of approach. They've we always talk about them losing out to the OTT players, but they've actually done pretty well out of the OTT players. Right. And it's only the fact, as you just said,
how have they done well out of them?
well, people buy data subscriptions, and they spend a lot of money to get. I haven't seen ARPUs come down that much, to be honest with you. I mean, we always talk about telcos' revenues declining, but they're all still massively profitable companies. It's more that they're flatlining. There's no growth left. As you said, in a market with 100% penetration, you can only grow by pinching a load of customers from your rivals, and that's the problem they've got. It's not. If we were still in a situation where only 50% of people in the UK had smartphones, and every quarter that the telcos reported, it was, huge growth in earnings and profits, people probably wouldn't really be worried about the fact that they're not doing anything new, because the business model you've got works really well. But they've reached a stage where they can't grow anymore, and there's that growth imperative that we have in capitalist societies, that you need to satisfy your shareholders and go somewhere new.
And satisfy your own avarice.
Exactly, yeah.
So, Jamie, this is something we've spoken about on pods before. One of the things that came up in this event I went to, and comes up consistently, is content as a way of them sort of growing. Do you think that acquiring content, or even getting into, as we spoke about recently, original programming and that sort of thing, do you think that's the answer? Is that where they're going to create this growth that Ian was just saying is currently absent?
I don't think so. I mean, mainly because you're asking companies to be. You nailed it in the first thing you said. You're asking them to change.
I've been stealing your thunder again.
You're asking them to change the very fabric of their culture. And right now, you've got an engineering company which has a lot of field engineers. These aren't software engineers,
right?
So you can't really ask them to do a lot of software-related things. The workforce isn't there. And on the creative side of things, these aren't creative companies. They don't do anything creative. They have no legacy in being creative. Even like advertising is outsourced to creative agencies. Marketing managers now are nothing more than spreadsheet tickers who just keep an eye on budgets and outsource all the actual work to agencies.
And pay Sean Bean or Kevin Bacon.
Get some stupid celebrities in who just completely
Vodafone, go on.
Yeah, just completely devalue the brands, basically. But you're asking them to be creative, and this is where I think BT are going to be okay, because they're not being creative. They're buying the rights to something that happens. They're not actually creating content. They're just being a distributor.
Trying to be HBO.
Then they're not, that's okay. Whether the price is actually is sustainable is a completely another thing. But all they're doing is become a distributor of content, which isn't too dissimilar to being a distributor of data. If you just think of it at a very sort of like basic level, they're moving one thing from one place to another. You ask them to go into original content ideas like Oranges. It involves a completely different business model. It involves a completely different type of hiring scheme, a completely different type of reward scheme as well. You're fundamentally changing the actual business. And let's be honest, 90% of original content ideas are going to be terrible. Now, how long a shareholder is going to be sort of happy to wait for the next Breaking Bad? Not everything is going to be. A lot of stuff might trickle along, and then all of a sudden you just have this massive spike because you have a Game of Thrones or a Breaking Bad or a Narcos or something like that.
And you've probably got organisations like HBO, which seems to be the best at this.
They're happy to sit and wait.
Yeah, but they're also they've probably also got all kinds of mechanisms where you've got various creative projects in various stages of gestation, and a lot of them are just getting rejected behind the scenes, and we're not aware of that. And they seem to be incredibly efficient at churning out these very popular things, and they do spend money on it. Obviously, Game of Thrones, they chuck tens of millions at every episode, but.
See if that changes when AT&T buys them.
What do you know? So going back full circle, that's a fascinating thing. So they've obviously got this culture within HBO of being very good at finding worthwhile creative endeavours and then backing them. And not many other people are very good at it. Even if you look at some of the Marvel stuff that's come out since Disney acquired it, it seems to have a bit of a Disney-ish feel to it, and it's certainly not as when I was a kid, I used to read the Marvel comics, and they were quite raw, they were quite full on. They weren't as they didn't have the polished edges that the Marvel stuff has now. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. AT&T, I mean, if they're sensible, presumably they'll let the HBO bit be pretty much autonomous.
Yeah.
I can't see that happening.
Right.
You know, you think about your typical telco investor. It's someone who demands quarterly dividends and keeping the dividends as high as possible.
Yeah.
You know, they've shelled out when you include debts, what was it, 118 billion or something like that
For
Time Warner.
Yeah, that was a fair chunk of change.
Yeah.
Certainly.
You know, they're going to want some money back on that pretty sharpish. Yeah, they can't sit around and wait for the next blockbuster. And I think that's where a lot of these content companies like HBO have been, you know, really successful, is that they'll turn around and say to people, you know, ultimately we've got to wait for something. We're going to go try and find it, but don't expect everything to be
it's not
to knock out the
nice
park.
Little quarterly reporting cadence.
We might do 2 next quarter. We might not. We might do 4 in 3 quarters, 5-6 quarters time.
I had one idea while I was at this event, sort of catalysed by a talk from a lady who works for Turkcell, and they've got, I forget the name of it, they got a name of some app which is like their hub. So it's equivalent to something like, I'm an EE subscriber, I get my EE on my phone. But I pretty much only use that app just to see whether, like when I was on holiday, whether I'd run out of data and whether I was going to have to buy any more and all that sort of thing. But theirs is more of a hub for various OTT things that Turkcell does. Yeah. And I sort of thought, well, what if
only Turkcell?
Yeah, so it's Turkcell's obviously got quite involved in
no, but it's only their content. It's not bringing it. Okay.
It's a Turkcell app
the
and a
Russian
gateway to other
do this as well.
Turkcell-ness.
Right. So MTS and Vayon, formerly Vimpelcom, have gone down this road.
Right. Called How Can We Avoid Uzbekistan? Or that's a different matter. Yeah, and I just thought, what if we really expand that? A bit of a tangent there, Jamie. Sorry. What if we expand that and we make that app a genuine destination? So not only is it a portal for some cool premium content, maybe, but maybe they introduce some kind of casual gaming functionality to it. Maybe we all play his games. Jamie was just saying he's just got rid of one on his phone because it's run its course. Clash of Clans, was it?
Yeah.
And I play these games on the tablet at home where you have to sort of check in quite regularly and sort of refresh and get your little virtual rewards and all that sort of thing. Maybe we could have some casual gaming functionality in this where if you check in regularly you end up getting rewards, whether it's something specific to do your phone like extra data or credits, or whether it's things like I think Orange used to do, like cinema.
So that's quite similar to what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago in terms of being like the super aggregator. Yeah. And I just think it's I completely agree with you, because it's adding value. You're not trying to steal value from someone else who's doing it better. You're adding value to the ecosystem. So I completely agree. I think that's the perfect way for operators to go.
Cool. Right. Well, having rather disappointingly agreed with each other, I think we'll call it a day there. But thanks a lot, guys, and thanks a lot for listening. Please join us for the next one.